You have been clear in saying there was no pressure put on Ukraine, no quid pro quo as it pertains to what is now being looked at as grounds for potential impeachment of the president. But we have had at least 4 U.S. officials under oath say that they had knowledge of a deal being offered that made military aid and a meeting with the president contingent on opening an investigation that relates to the company Joe Biden's son served on the board of. Are they all lying?
Well, I can only tell you what I know. And what I know is that the transcript of the president's call with President Zelensky shows that there was no quid pro quo. He did nothing wrong.
But were you aware of that deal that they are giving details of and sworn under oath?
All of my interactions with President Zelensky, we focused entirely on President Zelensky's agenda to bring about reforms to end corruption in Ukraine and to bring together the European community to provide greater support for Ukraine. President Zelensky said there was no pressure. We had a good meeting when the president had to cancel to stay home for a hurricane, and I met President Zelensky. The aid was released after that meeting.
But did you have knowledge of the deal that these U.S. officials have described under oath?
What I can tell you is all of my interaction on this issue with the President of the United States and President Zelensky focused entirely on 3 things. Number 1, the United States of America's support for Ukraine following the Russian invasion of Crimea and the war that Russia's been fomenting there. We actually, this administration, different from the last one, have provided lethal weapons for Ukraine,
and we've stood with them. That conflict never came up in the phone call.
Margaret, we've stood with them.
Did you have knowledge of what they're describing or no?
We stood with them to restore their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Number 2, President Zelensky was elected in a historic landslide and won parliamentary elections on an agenda to end corruption in Ukraine. And we very much wanted to understand the progress he was making on that. And thirdly, President Trump believed that it was time for the European community to step up. Those are the issues we made clear to President Zelensky and Ukraine. I think as the facts continue to come out, the American people again will see there that in the president's transcript, my interactions, there was no quid pro quo, there was no pressure. It was entirely focused on issues
I haven't gotten a clear answer from you on that, though, sir. I do have to leave the interview there, but are you saying you did not ever hear of such a deal? Is that what I understand you're describing?
I'm telling you that all of my interactions with the president, all of my conversation with President Zelensky, were entirely focused on issues of importance to the American people, ending corruption, enlisting more European support, and supporting Ukraine in a way that would restore its territorial integrity and stand by Ukraine for its sovereignty.
Because nothing quite says I'm telling the truth like Pence refusing to answer the question about whether he knew of Trump's quid pro quo with Ukraine, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 separate times. Now, I'm not saying Pence knew that Trump was withholding military aid as leverage to open an investigation into his political opponent, but yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. Because here's the thing, Trump is literally getting impeached for this. So if I'm Mike Pence and have the opportunity to exonerate myself, to completely clear my name on national television, I take it. You don't have to be a genius to figure out that the chance to distance yourself from a scandal that is going to get the President of the United States impeached and possibly removed from office is a pretty good opportunity. And yet that Pence refuses to do so tells us everything we need to know. Instead, he delves into an on-air filibuster wherein he pretends that his interactions with Trump and Zelensky have focused on US support for Ukraine, which is rich considering that the issue at hand here is the administration withheld aid from the country as they've been contending with Russian aggression. He says it's focused on ensuring that the European community is stepping up, only the European Union pays more than double to Ukraine what the US does. I found that in less than a minute using Google, and I'm assuming that the President of the United States has access to slightly better information than I do. In other words, delaying $400 million in aid for weeks while they pretend to figure out something so readily available is not a stellar excuse. And finally, Pence claims that his focus was rooting out corruption. Only, where have we heard corruption being used as a keyword for conspiring with a foreign power to meddle in the election before?
I don't understand how you can ask that question while at the same time admonishing the president for wanting to get to the bottom of perhaps one of the biggest corruption scandals concerning Ukraine in the last few years.
The president's going to make sure that there is no corruption there.
Everything to me is about corruption. I don't care about Biden's campaign, but I do care about corruption. And yesterday somebody asked me a question and I gave an answer, but always in the form of corruption. What I want to do, and I think I have an obligation to do it, probably a duty to do it, corruption. We are looking for corruption. When you look at what Biden and his son did, and when you look at other people, what they've done, and I believe there was tremendous corruption with Biden, but I think there was beyond corruption, having to do with the 2016 campaign. We are looking at corruption. We're not looking at politics. We're looking at corruption.
Right. To be honest, you would think that after seeing how poorly this whole rooting out corruption excuse worked out for his boss, that Pence would be smarter than to adopt this failed strategy. Trump is in the midst of being impeached because the only tire justification he had was to pretend that he was some warrior against corruption. Only, you don't get to claim you're fighting corruption when your methods to supposedly root it out were corrupt. Trump conspired with a foreign power to interfere in our election. He sought dirt on a political opponent from a foreign entity. He tried to cover it up by hiding the electronic communications and prevented administration officials and diplomats from testifying. That's all illegal. Trump isn't pursuing corruption, he's living it. And I get that the GOP traffics in projection, but this whole corruption thing is just plain insulting given what we already know. I mean, honestly, imagine thinking that we're all so dumb that even after the details of Trump's crime come out, after the polls showing that the vast majority of Americans believe he acted improperly, that you still expect us to believe you when you claim that this administration is only interested in the noble pursuit of law and order. And by the way, this isn't the only time that Pence has been caught stammering when confronted about his knowledge of Trump's quid pro quo.
Well, were you ever aware, Mr. Vice President, that an interest in the Bidens, an interest in investigating the Bidens was at least in part of the reason for aid to Ukraine being held up?
I never discussed the issue of the Bidens with President Zelensky, and
you ever aware of within the administration?
what I can tell you is that all of our discussions internally, I mean, the president and our team, in our context, in my office with Ukraine, we're entirely focused on the broader issues of the lack of European support.
Well, you were aware
corruption.
of the interest in the Bidens being investigated.
And
that being tied to aid to Ukraine being held up.
Well, that's your question. Let me be very clear. The issue of aid and our efforts with regard to Ukraine were, from my experience, in no way connected to the very legitimate concern the American people have about corruption that took place, about things that happened in the 2016 election in Ukraine, or about.
What could not be more obvious is that anyone with half a brain can tell that clearly Mike Pence was well aware of what was going on, and like everyone else in this administration, did nothing to stop an egregious act of corruption and a subsequent campaign to cover it all up. Just like Mike Pompeo and Mick Mulvaney and Rudy Giuliani and the rest of Trump's spineless sycophants, Pence might lean on this excuse that he's fighting corruption, but he and the criminal enterprise he works for are the worst offenders of all.